Hello and welcome to this module of the Tetration video series. My name's Rob and I'm here with Remi and Tim, and in this module we're going to be discussing scope design in a bit further detail. In one of the earlier modules we had an introduction to scope and how we would actually put some design constructs around that to build out our Tetration inventory. And working with both Remi and Tim, we've seen a lot of different customer scenarios and a lot of different drivers around how we actually build out the actual scope design itself. So today we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail and look at some of the options that we have available. So Remi, given the basis for scopes and general customer demands, what would you see as probably more of the most common options we've seen?
We've seen a few back and forths coming through. Some of them were related to location, some of them to environment, some of them geographies. We talked a bit about GDPR and stuff like that. That kind of stuff tends to come in as well. I think we've nearly seen about one scope design per customer, close to that.
Yeah, I'd say scopes are a very flexible construct, and they often represent exactly how a customer sees their organization and how they would like to map their organization into their data center, into their workloads. So it's a flexible thing. There is no right or wrong way to build a scope tree, and we've found that out from our experience, but there are some guidelines that we can definitely help suggest to our audience to make sure that when they're designing scopes in their clusters, they follow some of the things that we've seen are good to do, and maybe some of the things that you might want to avoid as well.
Would it be fair to say that you should probably mix and match what you see in those slides?
I think that you should pick a lane and stick with it. Once you decide that you're potentially going to go completely application focused, or if you're going to potentially go completely location focused, or if you want to maybe go environment focused, and we're going to talk through these different options. Once you've chosen that one, it's best to stick with that across the board so that you're not mixing and matching too much and everything stays very logical.
All right, so perhaps let's just take a start by looking at the example that we've really worked through the course of the video series. Hopefully it's familiar to the audience at this point. So really on that, we decided to take what is, again, the root scope, the view of everything in our world, and start to break that down piece by piece. As a first component, we brought the inside environment, the organizational responsibility for the internal scopes to create that first layer. And then really beyond that, this is where we start to see variations start to occur, right?
So that's an interesting point, actually, Rob. You're saying the first level of the scope in all of these scope trees is going to be focused on just differentiating between inside the organization and outside of the organization. We'd say that that is pretty much across the board consistent. You agree?
There is a slight variation I've seen is if you have a company that owns multiple companies, the top of the tree might be one of the child companies inside it. I've seen that happening a few times.
Well, I guess that does raise, why do we have layers in the scope tree in the first place? And what is the, I guess, in trying to get, or sort of pinpoint a layer in the tree, we're trying to achieve multiple objectives. One is for policy, another one is for role-based access control, and another one is for potential scale or growth at that particular point. You actually want to have a layer if there's reason to be able to have multiple functions on there. If you do have a tree that is like purely like vertical, or you've just got sort of single components in there, that may or may not necessarily be the right way to go. So having that object there for the inside of your environment does allow you to be able to potentially grow that out or to be more flexible over time.
That sounds fair.
Yeah. Okay.
So what do we have up on the screen here?
So on the screen we've actually got our, again, this is the example environment that we've worked through. We have the next layer going down into the where we actually deploy our applications or where our users exist. So here's where we're actually now starting to say we have the cloud environment, which is supporting our application workloads, but we also know we've got other environments that are accessing those workloads. In this case, campus environments, potentially branches. Again, depending on the organization, will depend on what those components would be.
And in this scope tree that we're looking at here, you say cloud. Does that necessarily mean public cloud, or are we talking about anywhere a workload could be running?
We're actually referring to where the workloads reside, right? So in this simple case, we've just sort of decided to create an object that refers to the application workloads, regardless of where they're actually being deployed.
Okay, so we're using cloud in an even more abstract way than you might refer to cloud to begin with, right? This could just mean any type of cloud workload, whether it's on premises or it's actually really in the cloud.
That's right, that's right. And again, so there are certainly reasons why you would potentially break this out, and maybe this is a good juncture to actually explore another way to actually break that out, right? Which is where we now start to look at how we might split those environments. Now, Remi, you've seen this in a number of cases where there's certainly good reason to be able to actually have more specific control over each of the environments themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen two big use cases around that. One is actually geography. Americas, EMER, Asia Pac. I have to give you that, Rob. You need those big zones to understand the communication which are cross-continent. That's one of the use cases we've seen. And then under those zones, then they might add some physical locations or local clouds. There's usually two reasons for that. One is data sovereignty. They have to keep data within one country. They want to know what's actually getting out of this geography. And those rules usually apply to a continent. I mean, in most of the cases, they're pretty uniform on one continent, let's put it like that. So that's one model that we've seen done a lot. So you would see a cloud in EMER, a cloud in APJC, a cloud in Americas, and you would see a DC location in APJC, in EMER, and in America. Then the kind of sub-model we've seen on that is also how you handle sub-locations. So within DC, for example, you might have 3 DCs, or you could have just 2, like East Coast, West Coast in the US is pretty common. Here, the approach we do with that, the reason for this approach is I had some customer tell me, you know what, I actually want to restrict inter-DC traffic because that's actually pretty expensive for me. So I'd rather have them just have their application running there and have a rule that says that they should not cross DCs. And that tends to fit the bill for those environments.
What would you say would be the implications from a policy perspective with a consolidated approach versus a distributed approach?
Yeah, operationally wise, you're right, it's more complex. I mean, you have an app. This app is running in, for example, EMER and APJC, and it's running across cloud and on-prem in both locations. Well, you actually have to break down your application in 4 pieces. One piece, which is this app, cloud, EMER, this app, DC, EMER, this app, APJC, cloud, this app, APJC, DC. So you'll have to do that, whether you want it or not. So what's the benefit of that? The benefit is that you will see traffic between components of your app when they're crossing platforms. So that's pretty nice if you're looking for that. Pitfall is that, well, it's 4 times the work. In this scenario, you would do it once.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're saying if you're striving for simplicity, one single point of policy, and you don't have an interest in exactly how you might want to split those applications across multiple locations, go for that one centralized point in the scope tree to represent all of your workloads.
Yeah.
But if you want to have location built into the scope tree, then that's going to give you more control across those applications, exactly how they communicate to each other, but it comes with a little bit of operational overhead. That's fair?
That sounds fair.
That's a choice.
Yeah.
There's one thing I would just advise to be careful of is like the multiplication of layers. Like if you start and you say, for example, we talked about the first level. So let's say the first level is, let's say it's a big banking corporation, and first level is bank for EMER, bank for APJC, bank for Americas. And then sub-level here, they break down locations. And then each location has, again, different applications. You're adding lots of layers inside your tree, which may not be necessary to do so. So you should, when you're doing that, it's like sort of, you said, pick a lane. So pick a lane, avoid deepening the tree too much. Not that the system will not cope with it, it's more that the more those layers come in, the more complexity derives from there.
And in fact, while it's not a hard requirement, we do recommend that you stick to about 10 layers maximum in your scope tree just so that it's easier as a human to pass through exactly what the scope tree looks like. You can have horizontally scaling scope trees that go very wide, but in terms of depth, try stay to a maximum of 10 layers in your scope tree.
Yeah, that's fair, and I'd certainly, I guess the purpose of this discussion is really to make sure that there is really a justification for every layer in the scope tree, that each layer has a purpose, and then we're not overcomplicating matters as we build that out.
Another thing I'd be careful of, I see lots of customers come in and say, oh, we want to be future-proof. So to be future-proof, let's add every single possible option. So this way, we're sure that it's not done wrong in the environment. So yes, I get the point, and I see why you would do that. Those scope trees are modifiable to some extent, and you've seen that in the scope module on the platform. So plan for what you know is coming. I think what you know is coming, not what you think might be coming. I think that's a big difference there. Had a customer plan, for example, for acquisition. This customer, that was 3 years ago, they never acquired a company. So they have their tree, which is built in a way to sustain like acquisition of 5 or 6 companies in their environment, but actually they never did one. So now they have those extra layers in the middle, which serve no purpose.
So you're pretty much saying keep it simple if you can.
Yeah, without a doubt. All right, so maybe let's just step a little bit deeper into the tree, right? So we've kind of been through maybe more of the organizational layer, the actual deployment layer in terms of the locations, data centers, clouds, etc. And then we now step into more of the application specifics. So we've, through the course of the examples we've provided in this series, we've really focused on a really 3-layer piece to actually define the application parts. So we've had some sort of application grouping or a service definition where a group of applications roll up to, and then we've got the individual environments that actually roll into those as well. Now, does that suit for every environment?
Like that thing is like, do you like cream in your coffee? Like it literally is the
Tim
same
does.
bit. Yeah, Tim does. Like lots of.
It has to be the right type of cream, though.
Yeah.
Has to fall down his coffee. Anyway. So yes, so it's really. Is there any good or bad way to do that? I don't think so. I mean, honestly, in both scenarios, I see the result at the end is the same. It's just a question of preference. I know what you've seen, Tim.
So I have seen more common scenarios like we see on the screen right now, where it goes to the application first and then splits into the environment underneath. But like you said, there is no one right or wrong way to particularly do this. It's how the organization thinks about policy. Do I think about my production workloads first and then the application, or do I think about the application and then the particular phase that application is in below it?
I think we've probably all been to customers where you present one option and they just simply say, no, that doesn't work for us.
Yes.
We see our world completely differently.
Absolutely. One thing though in there, prod and non-prod. What about UAT, dev? Why non-prod? What have you guys seen on that?
I guess it comes down to how detailed you want to get into. Does it make sense to have a separate policy for UAT and dev, or can I just lump them together into non-prod? And that's what we covered actually in the scopes module in terms of how you construct these scope queries. You can start with the generalized scope query that selects all non-prod types of workloads, whether they are UAT or dev. And if down the line you decide that, hey, I actually want to split that up into 2 separate scopes, you do have the capability to do that. So again, maybe it might make sense to start with something that's more simple. Don't try to over-rotate and create all of these different environments when you don't actually need them to be there.
Yeah, and really on the basis that we're just simply matching with a query against a set of annotations, the annotations against the workloads would still be specific. This is a dev workload, this is UAT. It's really just how do we construct the queries to build the groupings together for those. And I've seen both of those where we started with very specific groups, and over time the customer says, yeah, let's just roll them into one. It's just easier for us on that basis. But the option's there, it's very simple to adjust around that.
Yeah.
So I guess the flip side of this type of approach, where we're really kind of focusing on the application as the higher order component and a set of applications or individual applications that make up a particular group, the alternative is to really take the approach of we'll just start with the environment and we'll have a group which is prod or dev or whatever that might be. Could take the same prod, non-prod approach at this point as well, but where we are then breaking out the individual applications within those environments underneath.
I don't know for you, Tim, when I've seen that the most is when you have a team that owns prod and that they want to use RBAC. That's really, more than policy, it's more the RBAC approach I've seen in that scenario.
Yeah. And then the obvious trade-off when you put the environment above the application is that you might end up with two separate subscopes for those applications, one in the prod half of the tree and one in the non-prod half of the tree. So it's the same trade-off that you would expect to make when you split based on location as well. You will end up with two separate views of the policy. That being said, if it is what the team wants and you have a different team that controls production policy from dev policy, maybe it actually makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the really decision point there is based on role-based access control being the deciding principle behind how to structure the scopes.
Yeah, I would agree on that. That's what I've seen the most, at least.
Okay. And of these, in terms of perhaps the more common model, which approach do you think is perhaps more predominant across customers today?
I think to Tim's point, I would agree. I've seen more prod and non-prod below the application and above.
Yep.
Yes. I think it's the most common because it keeps that centralized point of policy control. It does keep things more simple in the general case, but it allows you to have that flexibility if you do want to provide specific policy that is relating to prod or non-prod.
Okay. Excellent.
That was pretty easy on that side. One thing I did rarely see is to split down dev and UAT. And I mean, I don't know for you, but I don't think I've seen a single customer in the end ending up splitting them.
So I think one of the things that we found as customers move through the micro-segmentation journey is it truly is a journey. It really makes sense to not boil the ocean to begin with. So UAT and dev, maybe at some point in time, they may require different micro-segmentation policies. But to begin with, when you're starting that journey, it's really the differentiation between, is this a production workload that I need to care about and it's critical to me, or is this something that if I lose it, if something bad happens to it, it's not the end of the world?
But there is also the point that we have both the specific annotations and the ability to deploy filters across the scopes, as we've seen in the filter module. That means that having the scope definition done one way doesn't restrict you from actually applying a very specific policy, even if they are grouped together, perhaps in a single scope for simplicity of policy definition and so on. So you can still have specific rules for UAT versus dev applied across those if you want.
That's correct, and that also gets the ability to use the policy hierarchy and the policy ordering, which we'll discuss in those modules as well, so that you can have those policies trickle down and control those workloads, no matter really what type of scope tree that you actually choose for in the end.
Okay, fantastic. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the...
I think those ones have been the big ones. Just the one variation I've seen, we didn't talk too much about the campus side of things and stuff like that.
Yep.
On the campus side, I've seen usually people tend to have one scope for campus and then filters below the campus scope for location. Mm-hmm. So rather, I've seen some customer go in and building like campus and then location 1, 2, 3, 4 in scopes. I mean, I think filters makes more sense. And you can see in the modules around ADM how you can actually make them external and so on around that. So I've seen that being done quite a bit. And it seems to fit better than having the like multi-scope structure on the campus side.
Okay.
What about when you choose the location in the scope tree or the cloud location in the scope tree? Do you go directly to the applications, or do you want to split between applications and centralized services in the scope tree?
Oh, fair point, the shared services.
Yes.
Yeah, that's actually, we always recommend starting with the shared services actually. Your scope design should start with shared services. And the shared service really depends on how they were deployed. I mean, I have some customers that have shared services per DC. And so they have DC1 shared, DC2 shared, cloud, a different story altogether inside the environment. In that case, I mean, you probably need 3 different scopes for shared services across different environments. Other customers use centralized shared services that span all the environments. In that case, it's hook them up to the top, kind of thing.
Okay. And you even do have that flexibility, right? Even if you're going for location-based scope tree for your main applications, you could have a non-location-based part of the scope tree for shared services, if they're globally shared services like DNS or Active Directory, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Maybe one thing, again, Active Directory has this concept of read-only DC, a domain controller, which is put into different locations, usually to kind of proxy in case of outage and stuff like that. I've seen some environment where the customer goes in for every single location, including campus, where they put their RODC everywhere in a scope. I don't personally think this is necessary. I think it's more overhead than anything, because then you have to go in every single one of those scopes to fix up the policies. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great example of the filter. Would be a perfect approach for that.
Yep.
What about if I want to represent the internet? Should that be a scope, or could I use a filter for that?
This is a question of the ages, I think.
Yeah.
There's a bit of everything on that topic, honestly. If you don't do anything, or just context, everything ends up being, in that example, Acme would become internet as well,
Yep.
right?
So the root scope always represents the universe. Every single possible IP address in the world, whether it's inside your data center or it's outside your data center. And prior to the 3.3 release of Tetration, we would nearly in all circumstances recommend you represent that as the internet. But now we have some changes in 3.3 that allow us to potentially represent either the internet as a scope or a filter.
Okay.
I would myself put it as a filter, because I don't think it's something that you would necessarily build role-based access control around. No one's going to have control over the internet, and you don't have administrative control, so you can't control policy on the internet.
Oh, really?
I dare say, nor would you run ADM against it.
Nor would you run ADM against the internet. Tetration has a lot of power, but I think it might not have enough power to compute all of those groups. So, I mean, we can give it a go later and see what happens. But
Okay.
So I think while you could build it as a scope, and the functionality is there to build it as a scope, it probably makes sense to have it as a filter that is attached to the root scope if you want to have an object that represents the internet.
Yeah.
No, that sounds fair. Which leads us to cloud as well. I don't think you need to break down US West 2A, US West 2B, US West 2C,
Yeah.
and so on. I've seen some cases where that's done. I mean, availability zone does not really influence policy as per se, or should not at least. So we'll look like that.
In fact, that's a good point. There's a couple of things that shouldn't influence the structure of the scope tree, right? If you are using, if we don't recommend that you bring networking constructs into the scope tree, for example. Don't use the scope tree to represent VLANs or subnets. That's not a best practice, I would say.
When you say that, that means I can still use, you're okay to use a subnet and apply that, for example, for inside, but don't
yes.
put a 10.0/16, for example, somewhere in the tree and just name it like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's really based on the foundation we're after, workload-specific policy, with workloads being independent of the environment, the infrastructure that they're deployed on. So building out our design based on networking constructs sort of leads to more of a sort of network-based policy outcome, which is ultimately not
It's not as
desired
flexible,
outcome.
right?
Yeah. But you never know, 10.0/8 could have like literally everything possible in your environment. We've seen some customers that make some campus and data center on the same subnet and stuff like that. So how do you address that in those cases?
Yeah.
Sounds good. Rob,
Okay.
what should we remember from this session?
Well, I think probably the key principles here are we really want to make scope design as straightforward as possible, and the key ideas are to keep it as simple as possible through the design process. Minimize the depth of the tree through the layers that are deployed. Think in terms of the purpose for each layer in the tree to make sure that they have a reason for existing there, whether that's for role-based access control, for some sort of policy control purpose. And just consider the options that we've presented here today in terms of trying to have something that works for your organisation. Every organisation is different. There is no one specific scope tree that will work for all circumstances, and we're certainly, I guess hopefully, the discussion today has helped just to formulate some of the thinking behind how such a structure could be put together for your world.
That's pretty cool. Tim, do you think about any absolute no-no in the scope tree? Something that you should never, ever do, whatever happens?
I don't know. What would be your number one no-no?
It's like one workload, one scope. We had seen that in one customer where there was literally like as many scopes as workloads at the bottom, so it's like 800 scopes.
Yeah, that's true, actually. I did see one environment where we had a scope per server, actually. And that kind of, that gets to the point where it might be, again, over-rotating a little bit too much, using scopes outside of their intended purposes. They really should go to the level of a group of endpoints. At the application level, you should stop when you have the endpoints in that application, but not the sub-tiers of that application, and certainly not individual workloads inside that application at the scope tree level.
And that's because we've got other constructs like clusters and filters to really give you the more granular detail, but the grouping itself gives us efficiency and greater control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't think we have anything more to debate.
I think we've talked about what you should do, and we talked about what you should absolutely never do. So I think that's pretty it.
Yeah.
Okay. So thanks, guys. All right. Now that concludes our module on our scope design discussion. For more detail, please go to cisco.com/go/teturation. Thank you.